Hello, everyone. Just real quick, I want to make sure everybody's seeing the slides properly. Um, okay. Hi, my name is Parvati Singh. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Public Health, Division of Epidemiology. Somewhat of an outlier in this group, but I've really enjoyed all the talks so far, and I think they lead really well into the topic that I'm going to present on. So my research agenda deals with understanding the population level, primarily psychiatric responses to ambient shocks. And some of the shocks that I have examined in my work include economic recessions, social stressors like 9/11, and the police killing of unarmed African Americans, including that of George Floyd, and then racial ethnic disparities in psychiatric outcomes. So in that vein, not everything at the population level is detectable in terms of a health signal. There are some indicators that tend to change quite quickly after population level shocks, those being indicators of optimism or despair, primarily suicides, indicators of how willing people are to invest in the future, and most of these that we are able to statistically detect tend to change in the short term, or what we call acute responses. And to that end, today I will be talking about changes in Black youth suicides nationally in the US following white supremacist murders of Black persons. So, the reason I got interested in this research question is because we have been seeing this worrying increase in suicides among Black youth in the US, as this infographic shows. Um, Suicides among Black youth have risen dramatically over the past 2 decades compared to their white counterparts. In 2008, suicide used to be the fifth leading cause of death among Black youth, and in 2018, it became the third leading cause of death. The percentage of Black high school students who have reported considering suicide, planning for suicide, or attempting suicide has steadily increased over time. And what puzzles psychiatric epidemiologists such as myself is that historically, Black persons in the US have exhibited lower suicide rates relative to other racial ethnic groups. But more recently, we are seeing a rapid increase, especially among Black male youth. And so far, we don't fully understand why. Some scholars have posited racism and discrimination as key factors underlying these trends, with our current understanding pointing to the fact that persistent exposure to racism and overt acts of racism may increase depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation, particularly among Black youth. So, research examining precipitating circumstances that correspond with increased suicide mortality or risk for suicide mortality often are phrased in terms of individual level attributes like mental health problems, relationship problems, interpersonal trauma and life stressors, and prior psychiatric history, suicidal thoughts and behavior. And less emphasis empirically has been on measuring the impact of structural racism with the incidents of anti-Black violence as extreme indicators of structural racism and their relation to Black youth suicides. You might be wondering why not all Black populations, right? Why would Black youth selectively exhibit more vulnerable associations with these exogenous shocks? And that's because we know from neuropsychiatry and neuropsychology that adolescence is a vulnerable period for brain development. Uh, Individuals, youths, and adolescents who do not have sufficient coping mechanisms uh, are still developing their prefrontal cortex. They may respond in adverse manners and through maladaptive mechanisms to exogenous shocks. Um, we also know that Black youth experience differentially higher exposure to racist events and exhibit greater psychiatric vulnerability to such events. So there are several papers that talk about direct and vicarious exposure to racial violence and how that may increase psychiatric symptoms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and perceptions of threat, particularly among Black youth. So neurodevelopmental adaptations to stress and external threats among adolescents and youth could make them highly susceptible to depression, which in turn could increase the risk for suicide death. Exposure to extreme racist events may elevate stress and threat perception, which again would increase the risk factors for suicide. Through suicidal ideation, reduced optimism about the future, increase in self-harm behaviors, particularly among Black youth. There were two papers that led me to look at white supremacist murders of Black persons and white supremacist violence in general and its relation to psychiatric outcomes among white youth. First was this paper by David Curtis that was published in PNAS, where they looked at mental health among Black Americans following highly publicized incidents of anti-Black violence. And most of their highly publicized list that they gathered through amazing methods had to do with police killings of unarmed Black Americans. But there were two incidents in their list of exposures that were actually related to white supremacist violence. The other paper that inspired this work is by Kara Tanksley, where she writes about, it's a qualitative paper, very, very well done, about how following these white supremacist events and targeted anti-Black violence events, Black youth through social media and news media experience disproportionately higher exposure to disturbing content. That in turn elevates adverse psychiatric symptoms. Taken together and with other research on this topic, we sought to examine whether just looking at national occurrence of white supremacist violence against Black communities may correspond with the most extreme outcome in terms of psychiatric outcomes among Black youth, which is suicides. And so we contend that murders of Black persons by white supremacists arguably form one of the most overt and heinous acts of anti-Black racism. And examples of such events include, the death of a counter-protester at the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville, the murder of Black grocery store patrons in Buffalo, New York in 2022, and the murder of Black patrons at a Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida. We know that according to the Anti-Defamation League, where we get our exposure data from, white supremacy characterizes a belief system that encompasses one or more of the tenets of whites should have dominance over people of other backgrounds. Whites should live by themselves in whites-only society. White people have their own culture that is superior to other cultures, and white people are genetically superior to other people. Motivated by these rationale, we have seen an increase, a nearly 50% increase in white nationalist groups between 2017 and 2018, growing from 100 chapters to 148 chapters, and their numbers peaked at 155 groups in around 2019. And they've gone from being thought of as fringe elements to becoming mainstream. In addition to becoming mainstream, research has also reported that white supremacist mobilization appears to be associated with violent hate acts. And in a 2021 report, the Department of Homeland Security named racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists as one of the most lethal domestic violence extremism threat in the US, and also the group as most likely to conduct mass casualty attacks against civilians. So between 2007 and 2011, there were 5 or fewer such events per year. But by 2017, the number had increased to 31. And what we know is that as white supremacist mobilization increases, hate acts increase, and that then may correspond with more white supremacist violence against Black Americans and minority groups. So at the national level, the aftershocks of violent acts of white supremacist murders of Black persons may ripple across the country and induce a cascade of racist behaviors. And we regard this ripple effect as a contagion, as a hate contagion, which may encourage racial discrimination, aggression, and violence targeted towards minority groups. We have seen this happen before, and historical precedents of such ripple effects include the formation of the Ku Klux Klan as a white supremacist response to Black liberation during Reconstruction. We have seen this as the violent response to school desegregation during the civil rights movement. And in the modern context, reactions to the Black Lives Matter movement has also included widespread escalation of counter efforts to strengthen white supremacy through encouraging acts of violence. Right. Several factors have contributed to this rise, including the use of internet and social media to coordinate protests and events, recruit members, raise funds, and connect with like-minded extremists. Um, and as I'd mentioned earlier, with this surge, we have youth reporting an overabundance of witnessing Black death and racist rhetoric on their social media pages, even in absence of intentional interaction with posted images. And that then has had a deleterious impact on self-reported mental health among these youth. So that brings us to our research question, which is there approximate temporal relation between national monthly trends in white supremacist murders of Black persons and suicide mortality among Black youth aged 5 to 24 years in the US? And we have done this examination using data from 2010 to 2019. So as our exposure, we identified national monthly counts of white supremacist murders of Black person, and we retrieved these data from the Anti-Defamation League Hate and Extremism Incidents Database, where for 120 months, where any incidents resulting in the murder of a Black person with the incident tagged as white supremacy, either under type or ideology, was included as the exposure. Now, the ADL database does not uniformly report the race of the decedent, the person who was murdered. So our research team, there were 4 people who independently went in and looked at the links, that news links and other links that are provided in the ADL database to corroborate or to identify which of the murder victims were Black. And 2 other people then went in and checked this manual identification. And once we achieved convergence between all parties, we identified that as our main exposure data set with monthly counts between 2010 to 2019 of events nationally of these murders. For outcome, we retrieved data from the CDC's National Vital Statistics Mortality Database that provides month and cause of death and race and sex, those variables. And so we created these monthly series nationally of suicides among Black and white youth aged 5 to 24 years by sex. And as a control variable, we our outcome included our outcome series included just Black youth suicides, and as controls, we used white youth monthly suicides. Now we come to analysis. So we know that suicides are highly seasonal. Um, I often ask this question when I teach parenting in seasonal outcomes and psychiatric outcomes to my graduate students. And many of them are often surprised to know that suicides actually spike um, in spring, counter to belief. And we also know that suicides are highly correlated, which means that the national patterning of suicides or counts of suicide in a month actually correlates very strongly with subsequent months and prior months. And this autocorrelation and seasonality presents a problem. So Nick Huntington Klein, who's an economist, he tweeted about how conventional methods of analyzing autocorrelated data present problems, because if you look at autocorrelated data series and you place, an exposure at any given event, any given day, there is a high chance of finding a statistically significant break. And the example here that I've shown on this slide is from his tweet for autocorrelated data with AR1 or autoregressive one parameters. But it just illustrates the point that with autocorrelated data, we need different methods. We cannot go with the usual linear regression approaches. And so for that, to account for that, we use ARIMA time series analyses, which stand for autocorrelated integrated moving average. So what is ARIMA time series analysis? I think the example that I understand the best in my mind is that for any time series, for any series, any signal, it has a core patterning to it, which I call the signal's DNA. And then you have deviations from that patterning. So that core pattern actually stays stable. And one example for if you're interested in understanding this methodology is if you've ever computed, moving averages or entered a formula in Excel. You enter the formula in the first cell and you double click it, and it could auto-populate the rest of the series. How does it know to do that? Because the formula that you entered in the very first cell is the DNA that you're putting in. And that would then drive the entire series. That essentially is what we call the ARIMA signature, or a signal's DNA. Once that signature is identified, any deviations from that signature can then be modeled as a response to an exogenous exposure, right? And how do we model that signature, the core signature, to sort of account for it? And that signature can include seasonality, autocorrelation, trending upwards, trending downwards, non-stationarity, all of those things. There is a method that I tend to use a lot, which is called the Box-Jenkins method, that uses an iterative combination to identify three parameters, primarily three parameters in a signal. The first is the autoregressive parameter, which identifies patterns that persist for relatively longer periods of time. Then we have seasonality or integration, which involves differencing. And then we have the moving average, which identifies short-term patterns or tendencies of a series. If we have the AR, I, and MA, or the ARIMA parameters of a series, we can pretty much construct what that series would look like if it were to go on undisturbed over time. And any deviations from that core signature would actually be the deviations of our interest, because then those could presumably have been caused by exogenous stressors. And so what we did was we focused on identifying the ARIMA signature, removing it, and then applying our exposure. So as I mentioned earlier, our exposure is the monthly counts of white supremacist murders of Black persons. If a month had one or two or more such murders, then that number was assigned for that month, otherwise zero. We used an exposure lag of 0 to 3 months. So basically, if white supremacist murders spiked in, let's say, May of 2016, May, June, July, and August were our response window that we looked at. And this 0 to 3 months window is, we adopted it for two reasons. First of all, we are interested in proximate response because the further we move away from the exposure shock, the less causal our inference becomes, because then we allow longer running factors to also play a role versus sticking exactly to the cause and effect. And the second is that prior work on other exogenous shocks uses this window and identifies this is the time lag needed for populations to absorb the shock and then react. Our outcome included monthly counts of Black youth suicides. We also conducted sex-specific analyses for Black male youth suicides and Black female youth suicides. And we used all of this, we used the Statistical Computing Associates time series forecasting software for analysis. So the analytic steps included identifying the ARIMA signature of the outcome series while controlling similarly for whites, because let's say February has fewer days every year. And so just by virtue of the way that month is defined, we will have fewer suicides in February because there aren't more days. And those kinds of seasonal patterning are shared across Black and white youths. So controlling for white youth suicides concurrently absorbs away a lot of that seasonality that is common, or trends that are common across both races. Next, we inspected the residuals or the deviations from the ARIMA signature for autocorrelation. And when we observed that, okay, this residual series is free from autocorrelation, we proceeded to the next step, which is we applied the exposure. We applied 0 to 3 month lags of the exposure, controlling for suicides among white youth and our ARIMA parameters. And we analyzed male and female Black youth suicides separately. So overall in our data, we saw in the US nationally from 2010 to 2019, there were about a total of 6,600. Oh, why does it say births here? I'm so sorry. That's a typo. It should say suicides. Black youth suicides with a mean monthly count of 55.7. White youth suicides about 50,000. Most of the Black youth suicides, total Black youth suicides concentrated among Black males, and about a quarter, less than a quarter being among Black females. Now, just to illustrate the patterning of suicides among Black and white youth in the US, we see a lot of seasonality in these numbers. We see a lot of correlations, but both Black and white youth suicides are trending up over a study period. This graph shows the occurrence and count of white supremacist murders of Black persons in the US. And unsurprisingly, starting 2016, we kind of start seeing a surge. Overall, in our study period, based on the ADL database, there were a total of 23 such incidents that we manually verified. And this was the exposure that was applied to the ARIMA filtered outcome series. So what did our ARIMA analyses show? What we find is that controlling for white youth suicides and controlling for identified ARIMA parameters, we see a surge in, we see an increase in Black youth suicides 2 months following white supremacist murders of Black persons. And what we believe is that it's not just that incident, but it's all the racist rhetoric and the surge, national surge in racism that follows such incidents, every single such incident, that cumulatively may then lead to this increase here. When we break this down, break down all the Black youth suicides by sex, we find that most of these increases actually concentrate among Black male youth, and we don't see a response among Black female youth. Again, the direction and the magnitude of association stays consistent, but among Black male youth, we actually see the effect spread over 2 months, second and the third month following exposure. We also checked whether our analyses of the outcome series corrected for autocorrelation, ARIMA parameters, and white youth suicides displayed any residual autocorrelation, and these ACF and PACF graphs show that they did not. So that gives us some reassurance that our analyses are not confounded by autocorrelation. And in summary, overall, we find that based on the coefficients and the number of events, the number of events of white supremacist murders of Black person, there are about 92 additional suicides among Black youth that can be statistically attributable to these events within 2 to 3 months following exposure. So this is approximate response that we have observed that concentrates among Black male youth. And in terms of just numbers or magnitude, it accounts for about 2% of all suicides among Black male youth over our study period, which is 120 months over a period of 10 years. So we find an evidence of proximate increases in Black male youth suicides following white supremacist murders of Black persons. And to our knowledge, this is the first set of findings that actually link extremist violence to lethal consequences outside of those events, indicating ripple effects of anti-Black violence nationally. The strengths of our analysis include quasi-experimental design and control of autocorrelation parameters, national analysis, and the limitations. The biggest limitation I feel that I would like to work on in future work is that we are unable to examine the prior psychiatric history of suicide decedents. Uh, Much of the literature on suicidology, especially among youth and minority youth, describes exposure to anti-Black violence and racism as a precipitating circumstance among those who may already be vulnerable to suicidal ideation. So that would be, I think, an interesting direction to take on. Some of the ways that I'm thinking about extending this work is to also bring in other indicators of adverse psychiatric outcomes. For instance, psychiatric emergency department visits following these kinds of events. Uh, Definitely interested in understanding why Black male youth exhibit higher vulnerability to suicides following such events. And also, regionally as well as nationally, are there any surges or changes in implicit and explicit anti Black bias following this rapid rise in white supremacist violence against Black persons in the US, and how that may then link to psychiatric outcomes among vulnerable populations? So that is it. Thank you so much, everyone.